Good evening, everybody. So I had the Kent State shootings and the Jackson State shootings as a topic of discussion for this week. Just to give you a little bit of context, as you're reading in Chapter 7, you see that in 1968, President Nixon was elected president, running on a campaign of ending the Vietnam War, or promising to put an end to the Vietnam War. However, after elected in November of 1969, a series of other incidents occurred in Vietnam, which only escalated the situation. One being the My Lai massacre, that exposed the murder of 400 Vietnamese citizens or civilians. So really an escalating incident, because the president came in on a platform of ending the war, and then the war only escalates after that. So lots of unrest here in the United States. So lots of active protests going on about the Vietnam War. Another big turn of events was the ending of deferment from the draft for college students and teachers. So in 1970, this was another kind of turn of event after more escalation from the Vietnam War. College students and teachers previously had a deferment from the draft. They were no longer granted that. And then soon after, the United States bombed Cambodia. So this kind of spurred this turn of events, which was not specific to Kent State, but was specific to the United States, in that there were lots of these types of events going on and lots of anti-war protest at the time. Kent State happens to be the most well-known protest that occurred on May 4th of 1970. There was a series of events that led up to the protest and the shooting, so I'll talk about those in a little bit of detail. So May 1st, there was an anti-war protest. Students were involved. It kind of escalated throughout the night. So it was first to begin as a peaceful protest, and then we had some violence ensue. And then it moved outside of the campus and was into some local bars. And when it moved into those local bars, there were rocks and bottles thrown, and the bars closed down. And then that moved everything into the street, and there were fires. And then more looting, rioting. So the mayor of Kent on May 2nd, Kent is in Ohio, I'm not sure if I mentioned that. The mayor of Kent declared a state of an emergency. So the rioting had gotten so bad that he decided he needed assistance, so he called on the National Guard. The National Guard was called in. By the time they got there, the ROTC building on campus was on fire. There's lots of protesters that were students and lots of protesters that were not students. On May 3rd, the governor comes out, after the National Guard kind of establishes some peace on the campus. The governor called the protesters unpatriotic and that they're the worst type of people that we harbor in this country. So he's not doing things to hear out the students and the protesters. He's actually escalating the situation. On May 4th, there was an anti-war protest planned at noon. And the university administration did all that they could to stop that protest, but the protest continued on. The National Guard fired into the crowd, and when they fired into the crowd, it was very windy. They fired tear gas into the crowd. When it was very windy, so the tear gas wasn't effective. And even throwing canisters into the crowd, well, the crowd picked up the canisters and threw it back, and this ensued like a lot of rock throwing. And as lots of accounts of events have it, 28 particular National Guard members were running, fleeing for their life. Some stories portray it, and they fired 67 shots into the crowd. 9 people were wounded and 4 were dead, and 2 of the dead weren't even college students or participating in the rally. So here we have a situation where things escalated, in a situation where the students weren't necessarily armed with guns, the National Guard fired back onto the crowd. This did a couple of things. So it showed the American people that the anti-war crowd was not just a bunch of hippies, a bunch of drug users, or people just kind of there to protest for no other reason, but it was actually the educated middle class there at Kent State that was pushing back against the Vietnam War. The Kent State shootings, especially of an unarmed crowd, escalated more of these types of protests, and Kent State actually closed down in May as opposed to June, and had 6 weeks of no class and no activity on the campus to kind of quell the situation. That led to other protests around the country, including one at Jackson State in Mississippi, which is an HBCU. Here, the students were protesting the Vietnam War, and it was claimed to be a nonviolent protest. There may be some rocks thrown or something like this, but the state police fired automatic weapons into a dorm, killing 2 and wounding 9. And unfortunately, as often goes with HBCUs, because this occurred at an HBCU, it didn't get quite the national press that everywhere else did. There was lots of text around the state police firing into the dormitory with no warning. No, you must cease and desist. No, stop protesting. They just fired into the dormitory, killing 2 and wounding 9. So these types of events were occurring all around the nation to protest the Vietnam War, and eventually the Paris Peace Accord was signed in 1973, and that essentially ended the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. So those are the stories of Kent State and Jackson State.